He glanced at her uniform, then smirked and shook his head. "I don't serve people like you," the cashier said, loud enough for those behind her to hear. A few people chuckled. She didn't argue, didn't cry, didn't storm out. She just turned and walked away. 6 months later, the same man stood in a long line outside a glass building, sweat beading on his forehead. Inside, in an air-conditioned office at the top floor, she sat behind the desk. Same face, different clothes, different power. She didn't serve him anymore. He was there begging for a second chance. And this time she had all the say. The grocery store was brightly lit but soulless. The kind of place where time blurred and every face looked like it was just trying to get through the day. She had been standing in line for over 20 minutes, holding a basket with a few essentials. Rice, eggs, some vegetables, a bottle of milk, and a pack of tortillas. Her hands were tired. Her feet ached. The soles of her shoes were worn thin from walking long distances and standing during double shifts. The name on her uniform patch, Isabel, was stitched in cursive and faded at the edges. She wore her hair pulled back, her face clean but unadorned. She wasn't here to impress anyone. She was just trying to feed herself and make it to her second job on time. When it was finally her turn, she stepped forward and placed her basket on the counter with quiet efficiency. The cashier, a tall white man in his early 30s with a close-cropped beard and the kind of smirk that came from a lifetime of unchallenged arrogance, gave her a once-over. His eyes didn't linger on her groceries. They went straight to her uniform, then her shoes, then her face. He tilted his head slightly, as if she were a confusing object rather than a customer. He didn't say hello, didn't ask for her loyalty card. Instead, he stared for a second too long and then said, in a tone that wasn't quite loud, but loud enough, that he didn't serve those kinds of people. Isabel didn't react immediately. Her brain paused for a half-second, trying to make sure she'd heard him right. But the smirks from the people behind her confirmed it. A woman in line gave a small laugh. Another man shifted his weight impatiently, as if even this brief interaction was an inconvenience to his day. Isabel's chest tightened, but her face remained still. Years of working with rude customers, of enduring slights and stares, had taught her how to freeze her emotions on command. Without a word, she reached into her pocket, pulled out her few crumpled bills, placed them next to the basket, and stepped away from the register. The cashier said nothing. Neither did the others. Silence was the most efficient form of complicity. She walked out slowly, not because she wanted to, but because rushing would have made it worse. If she had run, they would have laughed harder. If she had yelled, they would have said she was overreacting. So she walked out with the same calmness she had used when walking away from disappointments her whole life. She didn't look back. Outside, the air was thick with late summer heat. The sun had begun to dip behind the buildings, casting long orange shadows over the parking lot. Isabel reached the bus stop just in time to see the next one pull away. She stood there alone, arms wrapped around herself despite the warmth. The hunger in her stomach wasn't just from skipping lunch. It was deeper than that. It was the hunger to escape the cycle she seemed to be stuck in: low pay, long hours, and constant disrespect. She wanted more. Not luxury, not fame, just dignity. A life where someone saw her and didn't immediately place her beneath them. She arrived home that night to her shared room in a boarding house. The walls were thin, the fan was loud, and her roommate's TV buzzed through the wall with a soap opera in a language she didn't understand. She placed her bag down, sat on the mattress that doubled as a couch, and stared at her phone. A missed call from her mother in Jalisco. A notification from her bank reminding her of a low balance. A promotional email offering business courses she couldn't afford. She didn't cry. She never did. Not in front of others and rarely alone. But her jaw tightened and her hand clenched around the phone. She opened a note app and typed 4 words: "This will not last." The next morning, she returned to work. Her shift started before sunrise, cleaning offices in a corporate building downtown. She moved from desk to desk with practiced speed, emptying trash bins, wiping surfaces, and straightening chairs. The windows looked out onto skyscrapers she had never been inside. She imagined what it might feel like to walk into one of them not with gloves and a mop, but with purpose. She had ideas. Always had. But ideas didn't pay rent. Not yet. After work, she skipped lunch again and headed to the public library. She didn't go there to read novels. She went to research. Business registration laws, free online courses, e-commerce tools. She filled a notebook with plans, even if some of them felt like fantasies. A store that sold products she remembered from home. Items her mother used. Ingredients that reminded people of who they were. A place that would offer more than goods, something that offered cultural belonging, pride, and empowerment. She didn't tell anyone. Not yet. Dreams were fragile things. Best protected in silence until they had weight. For now, she continued her routine. 2 jobs, 6 days a week. Sunday was her only day off, and even then she used it to study or plan. But something had changed. The memory of that moment at the grocery store, of the smirk, the refusal, the stares, no longer burned with shame. It burned with fuel. Not because she wanted revenge, but because she never wanted to feel that powerless again. She began to move differently. More deliberately. She walked straighter. She spoke clearer English when ordering coffee. She started leaving small affirmations in her room, written on sticky notes. You are not invisible. Your work matters. They will see. What the cashier didn't know, what none of the people laughing that day knew, was that Isabel had a kind of discipline most people couldn't comprehend. She had suffered quietly and survived without applause. And those who do that, those who know how to hold on without being seen, are often the ones who rise the highest, because when the moment finally comes, they are already prepared. The weeks following the grocery store incident moved with mechanical precision, each day a mirror of the last, filled with work, exhaustion, and silence. Isabel clung to her routines, not because they brought her joy, but because they gave her structure, a fragile framework in a life still hanging by a thread. She clocked into her cleaning job each morning before the sun came up, greeted the building's security guard with a polite nod, and disappeared into the maze of cubicles and glass walls where people who earned 10 times her income would soon arrive and never think about who kept their workspaces spotless. Her second job, at a small laundromat in the evenings, wasn't much better. She mopped the tile floors, emptied lint traps, cleaned detergent spills, and folded towels for customers who barely acknowledged her presence. But through every task, her mind moved elsewhere. She kept thinking about the idea that had sprouted inside her head like a stubborn seed, an online business that would sell authentic products from Mexico. Not just the ones sold in international aisles of big box stores, but handmade, heritage-rich items she remembered from her childhood. Dried hibiscus petals from Guerrero, clay cookware from Oaxaca, chili blends ground in small villages, soaps made with cactus and lime. Late at night, after her shift ended and she returned to her room, she opened her notebook and reviewed her plans. Her handwriting was neat, almost meticulous. Page after page held research, import regulations, shipping costs, e-commerce platforms, supplier directories. She watched free tutorials online, hours of them, learning how to build a storefront, how to brand, how to market with no money. Her internet connection was slow and spotty, but she didn't complain. She paused the videos when they buffered and took notes in the gaps. Sleep came in fragments. She never got more than 5 hours at a time. But it was enough. Her hunger to build something overpowered fatigue. Every time she wanted to give in and rest longer, she remembered the look on the cashier's face, the smirk that had curled not just at her but at what she represented, someone who didn't belong, who didn't deserve dignity. She wasn't fueled by bitterness. It was something deeper. A refusal to be erased. On her one day off, she visited local markets and immigrant-owned shops. She talked to older women selling tamales from coolers, to butchers who imported rare spices, to artisans who sold homemade candles. She asked questions, took notes, listened. Most people were surprised by her interest. Some were skeptical. A few dismissed her politely. But 1 or 2 gave her names, cousins back in Mexico who still produced small batches of traditional items, a woman who embroidered tablecloths by hand, a man who made cooking utensils from volcanic stone. These conversations lit a fire in her. The idea that she could connect her culture to commerce, her memory to market, began to feel less like a fantasy and more like a plan. Eventually, she made the hardest decision. She quit one of her jobs. The laundromat. It didn't pay much and the hours stole too much of her time and left too little energy. She knew it meant living even more frugally, cutting back on things she had already minimized. But that single act of reclaiming time felt revolutionary. For the first time in years, she wasn't just surviving. She was choosing. With the extra hours, she focused entirely on building her online shop. She created a simple name, Races, meaning roots. She wanted it to feel personal. Not corporate. Not fake. She designed the logo herself using a free app on her phone. It was imperfect, but it carried her essence. She borrowed a friend's laptop to build the website and spent 2 weeks teaching herself enough to make it functional. When she finally launched, she didn't expect orders to come flooding in. She knew how the internet worked, but she posted it on local Facebook groups, immigrant forums, and community pages. She made flyers in Spanish and English and handed them out at the Sunday market. The first week brought 2 orders. One was from someone in another state, a woman originally from Guadalajara who missed the taste of real mole. The other came from a local teacher who saw her flyer and wanted handmade soap. It wasn't much, barely enough to cover shipping. But it was proof. Someone believed. That was all Isabel needed. She reinvested everything she earned, no spending, no celebration. She bought better packaging materials, printed thank you cards, and created a hand-drawn infographic about each product's origin. People started to notice. Customers began sharing photos of their deliveries. Small influencers picked it up. Her inbox filled with questions not just about what she sold, but who she was, why she started. She answered everyone. Kindly. Personally. She never used copy-paste responses. Every message was another connection. One day, while working at the office building, she noticed a woman by the elevators reading something on her phone and smiling. The woman turned her screen slightly as she walked past, and Isabel caught a glimpse of the Race's homepage. Her heart skipped. She didn't say anything, just returned to cleaning the break room with a quiet smile on her face. She still lived in the same small room, still cooked rice and beans most nights. But the air had shifted. People didn't look at her differently yet, but she looked at herself differently. Not as a burden or a worker in the shadows. She was building something now. Something with her name on it. Something no one could take. Every night before bed, she wrote in her notebook. At the top of each page, she repeated the same words, not if. When. It wasn't hope. It was preparation. The world still didn't see her. But it would. And when it did, it would find a woman who hadn't asked for a seat at the table. She had built her own. By the time the 3rd month rolled around, Isabel's online shop had transformed from a fragile experiment into a steady pulse of activity. Orders trickled in daily now, sometimes 3. Sometimes 10. The growth was slow but deliberate, like the turning of soil before planting season. Each product that left her hands felt like a message being carried across cities and states, messages that spoke of heritage, of care, of a woman reclaiming her space in a world that once tried to make her invisible. She had learned how to optimize her site with keywords, how to write descriptions that honored the traditions behind each product, and how to photograph items in natural light so the textures of woven baskets or the grain in handmade molcajetes told their own stories. She bought a cheap backdrop and made a makeshift studio in the corner of her room. During the day, it looked like a regular bedroom. At night, it transformed into a staging ground for progress. Her apartment was no longer just a place to sleep. It became a hub. Stacks of boxes lined one wall, rolls of packing tape and twine sat next to her small table, and plastic bins labeled herbs, candles, textiles occupied what little floor space she had left. Every item had its place. Every label was handwritten with a steady hand. She couldn't afford automation software, so every shipping label was created manually, every tracking number emailed personally. It was exhausting, but it was hers. Her hands began to show signs of the labor, calluses not from cleaning floors now, but from tying knots, cutting twine, lifting packages. Still, she didn't complain. She welcomed the ache in her palms. It reminded her that she was no longer working for scraps. She was building equity. Each product sold was a brick laid in the foundation of her future. The most profound shift, however, wasn't in the number of sales, it was in her voice. She started recording short videos for social media, speaking directly to the camera in a soft but firm tone. At first, she felt awkward. Her accent was thick and she stumbled over some words. But followers responded. Not because her speech was polished, but because it was real. She didn't wear makeup or stage her scenes. She filmed herself packaging orders, visiting local markets, talking about her abuela's favorite teas. And people listened. They liked. They shared. They began to trust her. More vendors began reaching out, immigrants, single mothers, craftspeople from villages in Mexico. They had goods but no audience. Isabel offered them something better than exposure. She offered partnership. Fair prices, full credit, and a place on her growing platform. She called it the Maker's Page and gave it a section on her website. With each new vendor she added, her store became more than a shop. It became a cultural bridge. Despite her progress, setbacks still came. A shipping delay led to 2 orders being lost in transit. One customer left a scathing review accusing her of being unprofessional and warned others not to buy from small sellers like her. Isabel read the words late at night, alone, after a 14-hour workday. For a moment, she felt the old shame creeping back, the doubt wrapping around her chest. But she didn't fold. She responded politely, refunded the customer, and sent a replacement package for free. Then she posted about the experience, not defensively, but with transparency. The post went semi-viral. Hundreds of people commented in support. Orders doubled the following weekend. One afternoon, as she stood at the post office counter dropping off 20 packages, the clerk looked at her pile and raised his eyebrows. "You selling all that yourself?" he asked. She nodded. "Looks like business is booming," he said, tapping a label printer. She smiled, not because of the compliment, but because for the first time in her life, someone had acknowledged her success out loud. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was being seen. And then came the email that changed everything. A popular lifestyle blogger who specialized in Latino-owned businesses had stumbled upon races. She wanted to feature Isabel in a weekly spotlight series. The woman had over 100,000 followers. The blog was linked in major online publications. Exposure like that could change the game. Isabel reread the email 5 times before responding. Her hands trembled slightly as she typed. She thanked the blogger, answered her questions, and sent high-resolution product images. Within a week, the article was published. The headline read, "This former janitor is reclaiming Mexican heritage, one package at a time." The response was immediate. Her website nearly crashed from the traffic. Orders exploded. She received over 500 messages in 48 hours, requests for restocks, wholesale offers, and heartfelt notes from women who said she inspired them. One woman in Texas wrote, "I showed your story to my daughter. Now she wants to start her own business too." Isabel didn't celebrate with champagne or parties. She celebrated by ordering her first round of custom packaging. Her name, races, printed in gold foil. She cried when the boxes arrived. Not loudly. Just a few quiet tears as she held the first one in her hands and whispered thanks to the girl who didn't give up. She hired her first assistant, a local high school senior named Marisol, who reminded Isabel of herself. She paid her above minimum wage and trained her on everything: packing, customer service, how to talk about each product with reverence. Isabel didn't just want help. She wanted to pass on the dignity she had once been denied. That night, after the orders were done and the inbox cleared, Isabel sat on her bed and opened her notebook. She turned to a blank page and wrote, "They said no once. That's all it took to make me say yes forever." The next morning, she woke before the sun, brewed coffee in her small kitchen, and opened her laptop. There were more orders waiting. More stories. More people ready to listen. She tied her hair back, slipped on her worn sneakers, and got to work. The world was finally watching. But Isabel had been ready long before the spotlight found her. The transition from a home-based hustle to a physical storefront happened faster than Isabel had imagined, but not faster than she was prepared for. Months of planning, of saving every spare dollar, and of building relationships with suppliers had quietly laid the groundwork for this leap. The opportunity came when a small, sunlit space became available in a local arts district, an area that had once been ignored but was now slowly being reclaimed by immigrant entrepreneurs, artists, and independent shop owners. The rent was reasonable, the location had foot traffic, and most importantly, the space felt like hers the moment she stepped inside. The windows were high, the floors uneven, and the walls needed paint, but Isabel saw what others couldn't: potential. She signed the lease without fanfare. There were no investors, no fan clubs cheering her on. Just her, a key, and a dream that had finally stepped into the light. Over the next few weeks, she poured every ounce of energy into transforming the raw, empty room into a reflection of her roots. The front half became a cafe-style retail area with wooden shelves lined with clay mugs, handmade candles, colorful textiles, and dried herbs. The back was a small prep space with a packing table, a sink, and rows of storage bins. The smell of fresh ground cinnamon and chamomile drifted through the air from the samples brewing on a hot plate. Music from her childhood played softly through speakers in the corner, soothing, familiar, honest. She named it Races Mercado and etched the name above the entrance by hand. She didn't want corporate branding or sleek modern minimalism. She wanted people to feel like they were walking into someone's home. And they did. On opening day, customers came not in crowds, but in steady streams: former online clients, community members, curious pedestrians. Many of them had followed her story online and arrived with kind words and eager questions. Isabel greeted each one personally, offering them hibiscus tea and the story behind every product on the shelves. She made eye contact. She remembered names. She shared why each item mattered. In the first month, the store outperformed expectations. Local press picked up her story again, this time focusing on how she had created a cultural landmark in a changing city. Neighborhood associations invited her to community events. Teachers brought students to learn about traditional crafts. Mothers brought daughters. People came for the products but stayed for the atmosphere. It became a safe space, a place where language, skin tone, and accent didn't make you small, they made you seen. But success brought new responsibilities. Isabel had to learn things she hadn't anticipated: permits, taxes, inventory systems, employee scheduling. She hired 3 part-time staff, including Marisol, who now helped manage the store. She created vendor agreements, learned how to budget for seasonal fluctuations, and began exploring partnerships with local farms for fresh goods. The workload doubled, but Isabel remained grounded. She woke up before sunrise, arrived early to set the tone for the day, and stayed after close to sweep the floor by hand. Not because she had to, but because she wanted to never lose touch with the ground she had built everything on. One afternoon, while restocking the front display, she noticed a young woman browsing the candle shelf with quiet intensity. Isabel approached, ready to assist, and the woman looked up with tears in her eyes. She said she had just arrived from Mexico 2 months ago, felt lost, homesick, and overwhelmed. A neighbor had told her to visit Races. She hadn't expected much, just some spices and a tea to help her sleep. But the moment she stepped inside, something shifted. The music, the scents, the warm welcome. It felt like home. Isabel didn't offer cliches or advice. She simply hugged her, the kind of hug that says, "I understand. You are not alone." Moments like these became the heartbeat of the business. More than profit or press, it was these human connections that filled Isabel with meaning. The very thing she had once been denied, dignity, recognition, humanity, was now something she gave freely to others. Meanwhile, online sales continued to grow. The website evolved into a bilingual hub with recipes, vendor stories, and customer testimonials. A blogger from Spain contacted her, then a podcaster in Canada. A small film crew requested an interview for a documentary on Latino entrepreneurs. Isabel declined the flashy offers but said yes to the ones that felt real. She was careful not to become a brand that outgrew its roots. Races meant something. It wasn't a slogan. It was her truth. Late one evening, after closing up, Isabel sat alone in the back room with the lights dimmed and a single candle flickering beside her. She flipped through her old notebook, its pages worn and corners bent. It still held the first sketches of her logo, the rough budget estimates, the quote from her mother she'd scribbled after that humiliating moment at the grocery store. She paused on the page that read, "Someday they'll stand in my line." She hadn't thought about that moment in a while, not since the store had opened. But now, as she sat in the quiet calm of her creation, she remembered every detail. She thought about the cashier, the way he had looked at her like she didn't belong. And she smiled, not out of vengeance, but out of clarity. She didn't need to prove him wrong anymore. She had already built a world in which he didn't matter. But fate, it seemed, wasn't finished with their story. Because the next day, just before noon, she glanced through the store's front window and saw a familiar face standing outside, clutching a resume. He didn't look smug now. He looked unsure, nervous, maybe even ashamed. He stepped inside slowly, eyes scanning the room, until they landed on her. His mouth parted slightly as recognition bloomed. Isabel didn't react. She stood still behind the counter, watching, waiting. Her heart didn't race. Her face didn't harden. She had no need to remind him of who she was. The space around her, the business she had built, and the people smiling behind her said everything. He joined the line of customers like everyone else. And for the first time, he would have to wait. The bell above the entrance chimed softly as the former cashier stepped into the shop, his steps hesitant, like someone walking into a sacred place with mud on his shoes. He held a printed resume in one hand and a small notepad in the other, as if hoping one could make up for the years that had passed without apology. Isabel noticed the way he lingered by the doorway, as though waiting for permission to move further. Customers moved around him easily, chatting, browsing, breathing in the air that now carried the scent of roasted cacao and ground cinnamon. This space didn't belong to confusion. It belonged to presence. It belonged to her. She had not expected to see him again. Certainly not like this, shoulders slouched, tie too tight, and sweat forming at the edge of his hairline. It had been over a year since that day in the grocery store. A single moment, one sentence that had humiliated her publicly, had eventually led to everything she had built. And now here he was, standing under a ceiling she had painted, surrounded by shelves she had built with her own hands, in a store he would never have imagined her owning. She didn't rush toward him. She didn't look away either. She simply acknowledged him with the same quiet neutrality she gave all strangers. He stood near a display of handmade soaps, flipping the tag of a lemongrass bar between his fingers, pretending to browse. Isabel knew the pattern well. It was the dance of someone waiting for a reason to speak. Eventually, when the crowd thinned, he approached the counter. She was unpacking a new shipment, clay pitchers from Michoacan, wrapped in paper and still smelling of fresh earth. Without looking up, she finished unwrapping the final piece, placed it on the shelf, and then turned to face him. The words he chose were measured. He complimented the space, said he had seen the article about her business, mentioned that he was between opportunities and looking for something local. He handed over the resume with a smile too careful to be sincere. Isabel took the paper without expression and scanned it briefly. The qualifications were average. A few years in retail, some managerial experience, and a recent layoff. The resume said he was dependable, flexible, a fast learner. It didn't mention arrogance. It didn't mention the moment he had denied her humanity because of a uniform. She didn't bring it up. Not yet. Instead, she nodded and placed the paper aside. Her expression remained unreadable. She had mastered this composure years ago, when speaking less protected her more. But inside, her thoughts churned. Not with anger, but with consideration. What would justice look like here? A public rejection? A reminder of the past? Or something else entirely? She told him they were currently reviewing applications for part-time stock assistants. He said he'd take anything, even just a few hours a week. She asked if he was familiar with small inventory systems, and he assured her he was. She didn't smile. She didn't offer warmth. But she did what so few had done for her before. She offered a chance. Later that afternoon, after the store had closed and Marisol helped lock up, Isabel sat at her desk with the resume in her hands. She remembered the exact look on his face that day at the grocery store, the way his eyes had moved over her, dismissing her not just as a customer, but as a person. It had taken every ounce of strength not to break in that moment. Now the power had shifted. She was the one making the decision, not out of revenge, but out of clarity. The next day, She scheduled him for a trial shift. 3 hours. Unpaid like all their volunteer onboarding days. Just a chance to observe, to see how he moved through the space, how he spoke to others. She instructed Marisol to supervise. Isabel watched from a distance, pretending to handle paperwork while her eyes followed his every move. He didn't speak much. He followed directions. He lifted boxes, stocked shelves, greeted customers when prompted. He seemed careful, cautious, perhaps unsure of how much of his former self he could show. Isabel noticed the way he avoided looking her in the eyes for too long. That was fine. She wasn't interested in shame. She was watching for sincerity. At the end of the shift, she called him over. Marisol stood nearby, quiet but alert. Isabel asked how he felt the day went. He answered politely, thanked her for the opportunity, said he hoped to be useful. He avoided any mention of their shared history. Perhaps he thought she hadn't remembered. Perhaps he was hoping she had forgotten. She hadn't, but she chose not to wield that memory like a weapon. Instead, she gave him the same option no one had given her, to redefine himself. She offered him a 2-week probationary role. Part-time, minimum wage, flexible hours. The position came with conditions, respect, punctuality, and training in cultural sensitivity. She made it clear that Races wasn't just a shop. It was a space of dignity. Everyone who stepped through its doors deserved to be seen. That included customers. That included workers. That included him. He accepted the offer with a small nod. His hands trembled slightly as he folded the paper she handed him. Over the following days, he worked quietly and well. He stayed late. He organized stock without being asked. When customers entered, he greeted them with a gentleness that hadn't existed before. Isabel watched the transformation with cautious optimism. People didn't change easily, but sometimes, under the right conditions, humility grows where ego once lived. One evening, as they were closing up, he lingered by the counter. The shop was empty. The lights were dimmed. And then, finally, he spoke. Not about logistics, not about hours, but about that day. He said he remembered. He said he regretted. He said he never imagined that moment would follow him. Isabel listened, expression still neutral. She didn't interrupt. When he finished, there was a silence that stretched between them like a fragile bridge. She told him something simple, that growth is rare, that accountability is rarer, and that he had a lot of work to do, not just on the floor but within himself. He nodded. She handed him a broom. He took it without hesitation. As he swept the floor she had once walked away from in silence, Isabel stood at the window, watching the streetlights flicker on. The past was still there, but it no longer held her down. It had simply become the soil in which something stronger had taken root. The weeks passed quietly after he joined the team. There was no ceremony, no announcement, just a subtle shift in rhythm. Isabel didn't speak of the past, and neither did he. But the air carried an awareness, a mutual understanding that the floor they stood on now was not the same one he had once ruled behind a register. It belonged to her, and she allowed him to walk across it not as penance, but as proof that redemption could begin in silence. His work remained steady. He showed up early, stayed late when needed, and never questioned the tasks given to him. He restocked the tea shelves, swept the corners others forgot, and helped elderly customers carry their bags to the door. He didn't ask for praise. He didn't search for attention. Sometimes, he moved so quietly that customers didn't even realize he worked there until they saw him behind the counter, handing them their change with a quiet, "Gracias." And slowly, the others on staff began to accept him. Not enthusiastically, not without wariness, but with the quiet nod of people who had all once been judged too soon and too harshly. Isabel observed it all with measured grace. She didn't micromanage. She watched. She noted how he responded to mistakes, how he carried himself when no one was looking, how he treated the youngest team member. a shy girl named Letty who had only recently moved to the city and still translated every word twice in her head before speaking. He was patient with her. He taught her how to align the packaging tape correctly and how to label the herbal blends by batch. It was in those moments, the small ones, that Isabel saw the shift. But the real moment came weeks later, when a customer walked in, agitated and loud. He complained that the tea he bought tasted different, that he hadn't received the discount he expected, and that no one had told him the soap was made with essential oils. His tone was sharp, his voice rising with each sentence, drawing eyes from around the room. He demanded a manager, demanded someone explain. The staff looked to Isabel, but before she could step in, he did. The former cashier approached calmly, gently asking the man to explain again. He didn't interrupt, didn't condescend. When the man raised his voice, he lowered his own. When the man made accusations, he calmly pointed to the printed policy on the wall and offered a refund or a replacement without hesitation. The customer, confronted with quiet professionalism instead of mirrored aggression, gradually calmed down. He left shortly after, grumbling but no longer shouting. The room fell silent for a moment, and then the rhythm resumed. Isabel didn't say anything right away. She simply met his eyes across the room and nodded once. He returned the nod. Nothing more. That night, after closing, she asked him to stay a few minutes longer. They sat at the back table where inventory was usually sorted. She brewed 2 cups of tea and slid one toward him. For the first time, they sat not as employer and employee, not as former adversaries, but as people. She asked how he was finding the work. He said it gave him structure, purpose, that he hadn't realized how much he needed that until he lost it. He didn't try to erase the past. He owned it, quietly, clearly, and that, more than any apology, meant something. Isabel told him he had passed the probation period, that a permanent position was his if he wanted it. Full-time, with health benefits and room to grow. His eyes widened slightly, but he didn't beam or cheer. He simply said thank you, voice steady, and asked what else he could learn to make himself useful. She told him about the new vendor program she was building, how she wanted someone to help onboard rural partners who didn't have access to the internet, to translate the culture behind the products into respectful marketing. He said he'd be honored to help. He meant it. As the months rolled on, he became a quiet anchor in the business. Customers recognized him. Some still looked surprised, as if unsure why someone like him spoke so gently or listened so intently. But he didn't shrink. He carried every box, answered every question, and never once made it about himself. One afternoon, a teenage boy walked into the shop, dragging his feet and holding a half-folded flyer. He said he was looking for a job, that he had no experience, but that his cousin told him this place gave people chances. Isabel looked him over, the nervous hands, the bruised pride, the hunger behind the eyes, and she remembered. She remembered being in that same place. So she asked him to sit, to talk, to tell her his story. And the former cashier stood nearby, listening, quietly, ready to train someone else. The cycle had turned. At the end of that week, Isabel stayed late to clean the storefront alone. The sun had set and the reflection of the golden lettering on the window glowed under the lamplight. Races. It had started as a whisper, a lifeline in the dark. Now it was a name people spoke with warmth, with respect. A name printed on packages sent across the country. A place where dignity wasn't just sold, it was practiced, lived, shared. She walked to the back storage room, opened her old notebook, and flipped to the first page, the one with her goals scrawled in tired handwriting. Most of them were crossed out now, but one remained unmarked. Not because it hadn't happened, but because it no longer mattered. They'll stand in my line one day. She smiled and finally drew a slow, thick line through the sentence. Because they had. But more importantly, when they did, she chose grace. And that made all the difference.